10-year-old Destiny Vaughn had carried a single photograph in a plastic sleeve for 6 years, ever since a house fire took her parents and left her the only survivor pulled from that home in Macon, Georgia. She'd been in 4 foster placements since, none of them permanent. And on the day she stood on the Family Feud stage as part of a foster family's team, she reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out that photograph, and handed it to Steve Harvey without saying a single word. Steve looked down at it, went completely still, and then, in front of 200 people and rolling cameras, turned and walked off the stage. He didn't explain why. Not then, not for the rest of the taping. The morning had started the way every taping morning does. Steve arrived at the Atlanta studio just before 9, cracking his usual jokes with the crew, running through pre-show blocking with producers. Backstage, Destiny sat with her current foster parents, the Alcotts, a middle-aged couple who'd taken her in 8 months earlier, alongside their competing family for the day, the Beckham family from Tennessee, a rowdy group of 5 who'd been rehearsing fast money strategies in the green room. Destiny sat quietly in the corner, holding a small backpack in her lap rather than setting it down the way most kids did, a habit her foster mother Linda had noticed but never fully understood. Destiny simply didn't like letting her few possessions out of arm's reach, a caution earned the hard way through years of sudden moves between homes. Steve did his usual round of greetings, complimenting Destiny's backpack pins, unaware of what she carried inside it. But nobody in that studio knew what was coming. Destiny's parents, Marcus and Renee Vaughn, had died in a house fire when she was 4 years old, an electrical fault in an old duplex that spread faster than either of them could get her out safely. A neighbor, hearing Destiny's cries, had broken a window and pulled her from her bedroom moments before the roof gave way, but neither parent made it out. Destiny remembered almost nothing concrete from that night, only fragments. The smell of smoke, a stranger's arms, the sound of sirens. But she had spent years constructing a version of her parents from the single photograph that survived the fire, found weeks later in a fireproof lockbox that had somehow escaped total destruction. It showed Marcus and Renee at a cousin's wedding 8 months before the fire, laughing at something outside the camera's frame, Renee's hand resting on her then flat stomach in a way that Destiny, once she was old enough to do the math, realized meant she'd likely been pregnant with Destiny herself in that photograph. The foster care system moved Destiny through 4 placements in 6 years, not because of any behavioral difficulty on her part, but through a series of circumstances entirely outside her control. One foster family relocated for work, another's marriage dissolved mid-placement, a third experienced a health crisis that made continued care impossible. A fourth simply didn't renew their foster license when it expired, and never explained why. Each transition meant a new school, a new set of rules, a new bedroom that never quite felt permanent enough to decorate. Destiny had learned, the way children in her situation often do, to keep her emotional investment in any given home carefully limited, a defense mechanism her current caseworker had noted in evaluations without fully grasping how it manifested day to day. Her caseworker, a woman named Priscilla, who had carried Destiny's file since the first placement disruption, had written in one report that Destiny displayed remarkable resilience, language that Linda later admitted made her uneasy once she understood the child better, since what looked like resilience from the outside often felt from the inside, like a child quietly bracing for an ending she'd learned to expect by default. Destiny's school records showed a pattern that mirrored her home life almost exactly: strong academically, well-liked by teachers, but consistently noted as reserved and slow to form close friendships. A pattern the school counselor attributed to shyness rather than the specific caution of a child who'd learned that close friendships, like foster placements, had a way of ending without warning. Linda and her husband Robert Alcott had fostered for just under 2 years when Destiny arrived. Still relatively new to the system themselves, motivated by their own struggle with infertility that had eventually led them toward foster care as a way of building the family they'd hoped for through more conventional means. They'd applied to formally adopt Destiny 4 months into the placement, a process complicated by the fact that Destiny's biological extended family, though not actively pursuing custody, hadn't yet fully relinquished parental rights on a technical level, tying the case up in a legal process that moved at a pace no one involved seemed able to accelerate. Their attorney had filed the necessary petitions, denied procedural priority since the court's docket for contested adjacent cases ran months behind schedule regardless of urgency. A second filing requesting expedited review on grounds of the child's prolonged placement instability was denied as well, the judge's clerk citing insufficient grounds to bypass the standard queue. A third attempt, this time enlisting a guardian ad litem specifically to advocate for expedited proceedings given Destiny's history of 4 disrupted placements, remained pending with no scheduled hearing date as of the taping. The Alcotts had spent nearly $4,000 in legal fees over those 8 months, money they'd budgeted carefully from Robert's salary as a mid-level accountant, without any guarantee the expedited request would ever be granted at all. Linda described the process in a later interview as feeling like shouting into a system that simply couldn't hear volume, only paperwork submitted in the correct order at the correct time, regardless of how urgently a child's stability hung in the balance. She'd started keeping a countdown of sorts, marking each week that passed without a hearing date on a small calendar in the kitchen, a habit she stopped only after realizing Destiny had noticed it too, and had begun quietly checking it herself some mornings before school. What almost nobody around Destiny fully understood, including well-meaning teachers who assumed her quietness was simple shyness, was how carefully she managed her own emotional exposure. She was polite, cooperative, and quick to help other children at school, traits that made her easy to place and easy to overlook simultaneously. She rarely cried in front of adults, not because she didn't feel sadness, but because she'd learned. Across 4 placements, that visible distress sometimes made adults uncomfortable enough to treat her differently, more cautiously, in ways that felt like one more small distancing she didn't want to invite. She told Linda, when asked directly how she was adjusting, "I'm okay, really," a phrase she delivered with such practiced ease that Linda only recognized months later how rehearsed it sounded. Destiny kept the photograph of her parents in a plastic sleeve inside a zippered pocket of whatever bag she carried, moving it carefully from bag to bag with each transition, the single physical thread connecting her to a life and 2 people she could barely remember except through that frozen image. She'd never shown it to any of her previous foster families, not out of secrecy exactly, but out of a protective instinct that the photograph, and whatever meaning she'd built around it, was hers alone, not something to be handled or commented on by adults who might not stay long enough to earn that kind of access to her. The specific reason the Alcotts applied for Family Feud was almost incidental. A fellow foster parent mentioned that the exposure sometimes helped raise awareness for waiting children, and Linda, hoping anything might help expedite Destiny's case, or simply give her a fun experience amid the uncertainty, filled out the application without expecting much. The callback came within 2 weeks, and Destiny, when told, asked only whether she'd have to talk about her parents on camera, a fear Linda reassured her wasn't part of the plan at all. The taping moved through its early rounds normally, the Beckham family loud and confident, the Alcotts a little quieter but clearly likable with the crowd, Destiny answering 2 questions correctly and earning warm applause each time. During a break while the board reset for a later round, Steve crouched down near Destiny, the way he often does with the youngest contestants, and asked her a simple, friendly question about her family. expecting the kind of light answer that fills a good television moment. Instead, Destiny reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the plastic sleeve containing her parents' photograph, and held it out toward Steve without a word. The studio went quiet, in a way it hadn't all episode. Steve took the photograph gently, and the moment he looked down at it, his entire posture changed. His smile disappeared, and he stared at the image for several long seconds, long enough that even the crew in the wings noticed something had shifted. He didn't ask Destiny anything. He didn't say a word to the audience. He simply stood, still holding the photograph, and walked off the stage entirely, disappearing behind the wings, while 200 confused audience members and a stunned production crew watched him go. 300 people stopped breathing at the same moment, uncertain whether to applaud, whether something had gone wrong, whether the taping itself might be over. Linda, watching from the family podium, looked as bewildered as everyone else, glancing toward Destiny, who stood calmly, apparently unbothered, as though she'd expected exactly this reaction, or perhaps no particular reaction at all, having simply wanted, in that moment, to share the one thing she'd never shared with anyone. Steve remained off stage for nearly 4 minutes, an eternity in live television terms, before returning, visibly composed but with eyes that were unmistakably red. He never explained, that day or in any statement issued afterward, exactly what about the photograph had affected him so profoundly, and speculation would swirl for weeks after the episode aired. But Steve wasn't done reacting once he returned. He knelt down in front of Destiny, still holding the photograph carefully, and said, his voice noticeably unsteady, "Baby girl, thank you for showing me this. I need you to know that showing somebody something this important, something you've clearly protected for a long time, that's one of the bravest things I've ever watched somebody your age do on this stage." He turned to his stage manager and said words that would appear in every recap of the episode. "We're going to pause the game for a few minutes. This has never happened in the history of this show, and I'm not rushing past it." A producer signaled for a break, and Steve waved him off. "No network approval needed here," he said. "This is me, Steve Harvey, and this moment gets the time it deserves." He turned to Linda. "Tell me about the adoption situation, all of it." Linda explained the stalled court filings, the repeated procedural denials, the guardian ad litem's pending request still sitting without a hearing date. Steve's jaw tightened as he listened. He pulled out his phone right there on the stage, something no host does mid-taping, and called a contact at a national child welfare legal advocacy organization he'd worked with previously. "I need an emergency legal team assigned to expedite an adoption case out of Georgia. A 10-year-old named Destiny Vaughn. 4 disrupted placements. Current family ready and willing," he said into the phone, loud enough for the front rows to hear every word. "I want a hearing date requested this week, not next quarter." He hung up before waiting for a response, certain of what the answer would be. He turned to face the cameras directly. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home," he said. "There are children in this country waiting years for a permanent home, while paperwork sits in a queue that doesn't care how long a child has already waited. That has to change, and it starts with people paying attention." Linda was crying now, and so was much of the audience, moved as much by Steve's evident restraint in not disclosing whatever had struck him about the photograph as by the situation itself. And then he did something no one expected, even his own producers. He announced that both families, the Alcotts and the Beckhams, would split the full fast money prize regardless of outcome, specifically earmarking a portion toward legal fees for Destiny's case. The Beckham family's mother crossed the stage without hesitation, embracing Linda and telling her that families like theirs deserved every bit of help they could get. 3 months after the taping, the expedited legal review resulted in a scheduled hearing that finalized the termination of remaining parental rights complications, clearing the path for Destiny's adoption to proceed without further delay. Linda said the hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes, a stark contrast to the 8 months of stalled paperwork that preceded it. A discrepancy that struck her as both a relief and, in its own way, a quiet indictment of how easily the process could have moved all along with the right attention behind it. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, it crossed 275 million views across platforms within the first 2 weeks, and the hashtag #ThePhoto trended for 9 consecutive days, with widespread public speculation about what exactly the photograph depicted. Speculation Steve never publicly addressed, saying only in a brief statement that some things belonged to the child who shared them, not to an audience. A year after the taping, Destiny's adoption was finalized, and Linda described her daughter as slowly, cautiously beginning to decorate her bedroom walls for the first time in the 2 years she'd lived with them. A small but significant sign of a permanence finally settling in. She'd hung a corkboard above her desk and pinned up drawings, a school certificate, and eventually, months later, a printed copy of a family portrait taken at her adoption finalization, placed deliberately beside, not instead of, the original photograph of her birth parents. Today, the Vaughn Photograph Fund, named at Linda's request in honor of Destiny's parents, has provided expedited legal advocacy support to over 540 foster children facing similarly stalled adoption proceedings nationwide, and to date has helped reduce average wait times for comparable cases by several months, according to the partnering legal organization's internal tracking, with a specific unit devoted to identifying cases where paperwork delays, rather than any substantive legal dispute, remain the primary obstacle to a child's stability. Destiny still keeps the photograph in the same plastic sleeve, though it now sits framed on her nightstand rather than hidden in a bag pocket. The first time in 6 years it hasn't needed to travel with her as insurance against another sudden move. In a later interview, Steve was asked directly, again, what had struck him so deeply about the image. He simply said, "That's between me and that little girl, and it's going to stay that way." Destiny, for her part, told a local reporter only that she'd shown Steve the photograph because he looked like someone who would understand, without elaborating further, a small mystery both of them seemed content to keep exactly as private as Destiny had always intended. Linda said she'd stopped trying to guess what passed between Steve and her daughter in that moment, choosing instead to simply be grateful for whatever it had set into motion, since the outcome, regardless of the unexplained cause, had given Destiny the one thing 6 years of instability had denied her: a home she no longer needed to brace herself against losing. What that unexplained moment revealed to a stunned studio, and to millions who watched afterward without ever getting the full answer, wasn't really about the specific contents of one photograph. It was a reminder that some of the deepest griefs and connections don't require explanation to be honored, and that sometimes the most respectful response to someone else's most guarded truth is simply to receive it fully, without demanding to understand every piece of it first. If this incredible story of a photograph nobody explained touched your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to find your family or your way home. Have you ever carried something quietly for years before finally sharing it with the right person? Share your story in the comments, because as Destiny proved, some truths are worth protecting until exactly the right moment arrives to set them free.